Okay, so that takes me to this first question I have for you. What is the best evidence that scholars use to determine that Jesus Christ existed?
Well, this is a great question to ask, Dr. Litwa. And Dr. Litwa is a religious scholar who has a relevant degree for this question. I would just love for a religious scholar to put forth the best argument for a historical Jesus. I have yet to find that person, so I'm hoping that M. David Litwa can be that person today. But if you want to fuck around and find out how bad M. David Litwa is on the historical Jesus, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at M. David Litwa's hypocritical position on mythicism. Now, I say that he's hypocritical about mythicism because he lays out a number of criteria for identifying pseudo-history. But yet, he ends up utilizing all of these criteria in his attempt to prove that Jesus existed historically. M. David Litwa seems to be a really good example of how historicists use pseudo-history in order to prove their point. It's like that Pokemon meme where Pikachu hurts itself in the confusion. M. David Litwa successfully invalidates his own position while attempting to invalidate the mythicist position. But first, we do have to ask, who is M. David Litwa? As we do with all historical scholars, let's take a look at M. David Litwa's credentials. Well, it seems like he has a Master's of Theology from Duke University. We had previously discussed how bad Duke University seems to be when it comes to their bias towards Christianity. But more importantly, this is a Master's of Theology and nothing related to history. He also has a Master's of Divinity from Emory College, which is a private religious college. Definitely a biased institution, but more importantly, not a degree relevant to history. And finally, he has a Religious Studies PhD from the University of Virginia. But I want to be very clear that it's not that Dr. Litwa doesn't have any degrees that are relevant to the historical Jesus question. The problem that I'm pointing out here is just that he's not a historian. He's an expert in religion, specifically Christianity. When we talk about how these scholars just simply will not entertain mythicism as a hypothesis, it's because these scholars are not historians. They are trained to understand and defend their own religion. As we'll see with Dr. Litwa, he is very good at doing that. Alright, now let's get into this pseudo-history criteria. Now, pseudo-history is prevalent in this particular discussion of historical Jesus studies. But how do we identify pseudo-history? Well, Dr. Litwa does have some criteria about this point. First, Dr. Litwa seems to be very much against the hypothesis of interpolation, except when it's integral to his own argument.
Scholarship, whatever it is, ought to be able to be proved wrong. And you cannot simply eliminate data by a theory of interpolation.
So, a theory of interpolation that proves that some piece of evidence isn't actually a piece of evidence for whatever conclusion someone's coming to is not tolerated by Dr. Litwa. According to Dr. Litwa, that's unjustly eliminating data despite the fact that the hypothesis of interpolation is the most viable explanation for a lot of things that we have in historical texts. Apparently, all of the scholarship that uses interpolation to explain some piece of information is just eliminating uncomfortable data. Of course, he has his own way of overcoming uncomfortable historical data.
And when data comes into your purview that contradicts your dogmatic position, instead of dealing with that data head on and revising your position, you twist that data or mold it or erase it or somehow skirt around it so that you can maintain your dogmatic position. Okay.
Right.
That is dogmatism. Okay.
So instead of scrutinizing new information to see if it actually refutes your position, you should just automatically accept it without any kind of scrutinizing whatsoever and revise your current position so that it uses that new information without any kind of thought about it. Well, I don't know. That sounds like real scholarship to me. I don't know what you guys are thinking out there. Actually, Dr. Litwa goes as far as to describe what actual scholarship looks like.
Scholarship is somewhere in the middle. Scholarship works inductively. And scholarship, whatever scholarship doesn't propose dogmas, it proposes hypotheses. And every hypothesis can be disproved by data that everyone accepts. Okay.
Now, I do agree that scholarship shouldn't have any dogmatic statements or positions, because dogmatic statements or positions are taken to be true regardless of any new or other information that we have. But it seems to me that Dr. Litwall has an ad populum requirement for accepting any piece of historical evidence. Now, considering that New Testament study seems to be dogmatic about both the historical Jesus as well as the resurrection, it seems to me that Dr. Litwall has effectively described New Testament studies as being utterly useless as actual scholarship. So thank you for that, Dr. Litwall. So, what have we established with his pseudo-history criteria? We have established that interpolation is not a viable explanation for any piece of information, and that we should do no critical analysis on information that is brought up that supposedly refutes our arguments. The only valid counter-arguments to a position are the ones that everybody agrees refutes that position. Now, this doesn't sound like any kind of real scholarly criteria, but it is the criteria that Dr. Litwall has established at the very beginning of this video. And any violation of any of these criteria would indicate that someone might, or most plausibly, be doing pseudo-history. This is going to bite him in the ass here in a minute. Now, let's see what Dr. Litwall claims is the best historical evidence for Jesus.
Well, it's a great question, but in a sense, it's a little bit of an odd question. You know, when classicists and other historians of the ancient world, when they want to study other figures such as Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus or Herod the Great, or even Apollonius of Tyana, they don't usually start with the question, did this figure exist?
Well, that's not entirely accurate. We do question whether certain figures actually existed in history. It seems very pertinent that if there is a claim of somebody doing something in history, we might first want to verify that that somebody existed or that event even existed in history. That is, if we haven't already done that already. Otherwise, it's just a wild claim that may or may not have happened. So it kind of seems like one of the basic first steps of doing any kind of historical research on some event or person is that you would need to verify that that person really existed in history. That is, before we could verify that that person did anything else. And we have done this for every counterexample that historicists have come up with. So this really isn't a new argument.
Fairness, I think there's a lot of good evidence for the existence of a physical man, Jesus. And I'll just start with sort of evidence internal to Christianity. So you have Paul, and Paul probably never saw the physical Jesus. I mean, actually, we don't actually fully know that. I mean, he might have conceivably. We don't actually know, but he makes no claim to doing that.
If there is no way that we could ever show that Paul actually met a physical Jesus, then why bring it up as evidence? Seems kind of like superfluous information at this point. Also, if Paul had actually met the physical Jesus, that would be kind of weird considering how Paul writes about Jesus in his epistles. And that's why nobody claims that Paul ever met a physical Jesus except for apologists. How about we work with information that we do have instead of speculating about information that we don't have?
But Paul does say some important things in Galatians, which is one of his earlier letters. He says, first of all, that Jesus was born of a woman. And if you're born of a woman, then that's a pretty good indication that you are a physical human being, and that Paul did consider Jesus to be a physical human being.
Well, I both agree and disagree with this section. I agree that Paul thought of Jesus as having a physical body, but I disagree with the idea that Paul thought that this body was naturally birthed by a woman. Now, I know, before you shit a brick or something, he would claim that I'm just unjustly eliminating data. But that's not what I'm doing. He is actually the one that's unjustly eliminating data here. And the data that he's unjustly eliminating is the fact that Paul uses words that's more likely to indicate manufacture rather than a literal human birth. In order to refer to natural human births, Paul feels compelled to use a completely different Greek word. Now, I've discussed this plenty of times before, so I'll have links in the description that goes into further detail about this nuance. The second piece of data that he's unjustly eliminating is the fact that the born of a woman phrase is contained within an allegory. And Paul explicitly tells us that this is an allegory within that same passage. So it kind of seems to me like Dr. Litwa is violating his own criteria for pseudo-history. He is unjustly eliminating data instead of just taking it head on and revising his position. Sounds like someone's doing pseudo-history.
In Romans, the introduction, he says that Jesus was of the seed of David, and that would indicate that he is in the physical genealogy and is in the bloodline of the Davidic king. And so whether or not you actually believe that is irrelevant here. The point is that Paul considered Jesus to be a flesh and blood character in the bloodline of another real human being.
Well, here again, Dr. Litwa seems to be employing pseudo-history as indicated by his own criteria. In the context of Judaism and early Christianity, someone doesn't have to be directly born of a person in order to be considered the seed of that person, nor does being the seed of some person indicate direct lineage. This passage can work both ways as being literally born of somebody from the lineage of David, the seed of David, or somebody that was perhaps manufactured using the seed of David. My point is that this particular verse is vague. Paul definitely believed in the divine manufacture of bodies, considering his position on not only Adam's body, but also our future resurrection bodies. Now, he obviously believed that there were people that were naturally born, but he is very sure to distinguish between the two situations. And Paul makes sure to lump Jesus's body, his physical body, in with Adam's body as well as our future resurrection bodies, which is to say that they are all manufactured. He is unjustly eliminating data and solely focusing on his conclusion. That's not only pseudo-history, but also a dogmatic methodology.
The other thing to point out is that Paul knew Peter, James, and John, whom he calls pillars in the letter to Galatians. And the question here is, so why are these guys pillars? And why does Paul seem to be in conflict with them? Well, that's a long story, but the shortcut answer is they were pillars because they were eyewitnesses of the physical Jesus. And in fact, James, Paul doesn't say this directly, but it's widely known that James claimed to be the brother of Jesus physically. Okay, so
nowhere does Paul ever indicate that these pillars of early Christianity were eyewitnesses of Jesus. This is purely fabricated information. I do appreciate that he acknowledges that Paul never directly states that James is the brother of Jesus, or rather the Lord, just that people know of this. Where is he getting this information? It's not from Paul or any other contemporary source. Then that means that it's a post hoc realization. Even so, if just people considered James to be a blood relative of Jesus, that doesn't mean that he actually was a blood relative of Jesus. It's just that people believed it. But it's quite obvious from the passage that the James that he's referring to here is just another general Christian. So he ends up twisting and molding information to agree with him, which violates his own criteria for identifying pseudo-history. And that's not even accounting for the fabricated information in this section, which would, by anybody's measure, be considered pseudo-history.
Basically, there's important evidence. Paul also, despite what he says in Galatians, Paul also has been in and out of Jerusalem, and he knows very well that he's picked up traditions from these people who knew Jesus as a physical person, okay? And he reveals this in 1 Corinthians 15 and says that, I'm handing on to you what was delivered to me, okay, delivered to me by other people. And then he goes on and says that there were people, including James, including Peter, including 500 people at one time, who saw Jesus as risen from the dead. Now, Paul doesn't claim to get this revelation from heaven. Okay. He's getting this from people, the people themselves who saw Jesus. Okay.
But that's not what Paul says. And again, this is also Dr. Litwa twisting and molding information so that it agrees with him, which makes it pseudo-history by his own criteria. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul never indicates that he got this information from other people. He got this information from visions of Jesus and the scriptures, which he actually directly says in 1 Corinthians 15. At the very beginning of chapter 15, when he says that he is passing on what was handed to him, the only references that we get from Paul are scriptures and Revelation. So what he's most probably talking about is Jesus illuminating these facts to him in a vision. Definitely not that other people who were eyewitnesses to Jesus's death, burial, resurrection, not that other people that were witnesses to Jesus's crucifixion, death, and resurrection were the ones that gave it to him. And as far as I can tell from the historical information, we don't have any evidence that there were 500 witnesses to the resurrection. This might as well just be a made-up claim. Whether Paul made it up or somebody else did, that doesn't matter. The fact is that Paul never mentions an eyewitness account of Jesus' death. So yet again, Dr. Litwa is utilizing pseudo-history in order to defend his position on Jesus. You know, he's kind of starting to sound like a dogmatic apologist at this point.
Now, it's often said by mythicists that that these were all visions, and so on and so forth. And I honestly have to say that that strikes me as not a statement based on assumptions. And the fact is, these aren't called visions of the resurrected Jesus. It is simply, the Greek word is simply ophthi, that Jesus appeared to these people, literally was seen by these people. It can also be translated simply was seen. Jesus was seen by Cephas, he was seen by Peter, he was seen by 500 brothers at the same time.
This isn't speculation. If these people were seeing or experiencing something they interpreted as the risen Christ, then the most likely conclusion is that it was a vision or hallucination. Paul even claims that he got revelation or visions or hallucinations of the risen Christ. That's what enabled him to be an apostle. So the most likely scenario is hallucinations or visions. More than likely hallucinations, let's be real. But more importantly, this also isn't a mythicist argument. The fact that these visions or hallucinations are just claims is a widely accepted argument in the historicity of the resurrection discussion. No critical scholar accepts that these visions are evidence of a resurrected Jesus. They are just claims that he did. Dr. Litwa is allowing his religious bias to cloud his historical analysis. Although it does kind of seem like Dr. Litwa has no interest in doing real historical analysis on this question, considering that he seems to only ever be doing pseudo-history, even by his own standards. Even this point is twisting and molding data rather than facing it head on, like he requires us to do.
Now, I know that other people are more, in terms of psychology, are have much more knowledge, and I'm not a psychologist. But if Paul, and we have to take him at his word here, we don't have to believe him, but we have to believe that he believed what he was saying. And if he believed that 500 people saw Jesus risen from the dead, then I would put my money on that not being a dream, because 500 people don't separately dream Jesus. Even 2 or 3 people don't separately dream Jesus.
Well, he's assuming that these 500 individuals actually existed, which we have no evidence for. What we do have evidence for is a very general misspelling that happens in this section. It's one of the most common spelling mistakes made by transcribers, which increases the likelihood of it occurring. Correcting the spelling mistake would turn appeared to 500 witnesses to appeared over the Pentecost. Now, I know he doesn't really like the interpolation hypothesis, even though this is like an accidental interpolation. I'm not using that to refute the 500 witnesses. We just simply don't have any evidence of these 500 witnesses other than this claim. And that's all this is. A claim. On the other hand, Mass hallucinations and similarities in dreams are a thing that happen, and I'd say that they are vastly more likely to happen than a dead Jew resurrecting. So it seems to me that Dr. Litwa is unjustly eliminating data instead of facing it head on and revising his position.
Here and say that we don't exactly know what these are, but I think it's false to say that these are just sort of dreams or things that early Christians experienced in trance states, and then they historicized and so on and so forth.
Okay, but you're not really giving us a good reason to disregard common psychological phenomena for magical divine appearances. Again, he's baselessly claiming that Jesus resurrecting is more likely and therefore unjustly eliminating data, all because of his dogmatic view of Christianity.
Now, there's really nothing, or at least to me, nothing convincing in world mythology that would demand that, that these gospel writers are pulling from, that would demand that Jesus be born or that Jesus be of Galilean heritage. Okay, so there's a bit of a local color in the story that Jesus is a man from Galilee. Now, nothing really compelled the synoptic writers to say, or John to say that he was from Galilee. I mean, he could have been from someplace that was much more important. So to my mind, that local color element that specific places in Galilee are mentioned, is it like Capernaum and Nazareth and so on and so forth. That's a great indication of someone who at least thinks that they're writing history.
So because gospel writers wrote about real places, that means that they were writing history, or they at least thought they were writing history? We actually covered this a few times recently. Something Spider-Man, something New York. But let's put it in the same terms as Dr. Litwa did. There was nothing to compel Stan Lee or Steve Ditko to place Spider-Man in New York City, and they included real places in the United States and real people that existed at the time. Seems like a great indication of someone who at least thinks they're writing history. Regardless of the Spider-Man argument against Dr. Litwa here, it's just false to say that there was nothing compelling the gospel writers to place Jesus in the time and place that he supposedly existed. Jesus was envisioned as accomplishing these things in the time and place that he is referenced to be in, because that is what is indicated by the scriptures to the rabbis who were writing these things. He was placed in Galilee, Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem, all because the scriptures said that he would be. He performed miracles because of the scriptures. Saying that they had no compelling reason to paint Jesus in the light that they did is just unjustly eliminating data because of Dr. Litwa's commitment to his dogmatic view of Christianity.
That's fine. But in terms of the basic narrative of Jesus as a man, a peasant born in Galilee, who is crucified under a definite and known procurator, Pontius Pilate, for whom we have independent attestation. And there's nothing certainly in world mythology or in Jewish mythology that would demand that he be crucified under Pilate. Okay.
That's just not true either. Jewish rabbis were pretty deep into reinterpreting the Old Testament scriptures to give them some kind of information about the Messiah that was coming. Giggity. The Gospels, through the genealogies and other references, do give us an indication of when the Messiah was supposed to be making an appearance. There were also prophecies about how the Messiah was to be shamed and killed in order to absolve sins. And Paul makes it very clear that the scriptures indicate that the Messiah was to die. So to say that there was nothing in Jewish mythology to compel the gospel writers to paint Jesus in a certain light is just false. While Pilate isn't indicated necessarily, this is a product of the Gospels, as Paul never identifies Pilate nor the Romans as being the ones that killed Jesus. Even early church fathers like Origen understand that Paul considered Satan and his demons to have been the ones to kill Jesus. So again, Dr. Litwa is unjustly eliminating data rather than facing it head on and changing his position.
So sometimes people point to the expulsion of the Jews under Claudius, and it's Suetonius who informs us about this in chapter 25 of the book the life of Claudius, part of his life of the Caesars. And basically the text says that Claudius expelled the Jews impulsari Christo, that is at the instigation of Christus. And the scholars will disagree on this, but I think that Christus is Christ. I think that this is internal Jewish rioting over Christians who have come and missionized the Jews, and there's turbulence, and the Jews can't disagree about the messianic status of Christ, and so Claudius just takes care of the problem by expelling these two different parties of Jews who are just causing a lot of trouble.
There is literally no evidence to suggest that this was an internal fight between Jews and Christians. In fact, it was just the Jews being led by Chrestus that was causing a lot of disruption. And thus, Claudius ended up expelling the Jews. Everything that Dr. Litwa said is not found in the evidence. He has fabricated this information in order to be evidence of Jesus. And it also doesn't make sense that Claudius would be referring to Jesus Christ right here in the first place. This occurred in 55 CE, which was a good 20 years after Jesus supposedly died. Dr. Litwa cannot hold to the veracity of the Gospels and also think that Jesus lived to 55 CE at least. And again, he's unjustly eliminating data, and instead of revising his position and facing this information head on, he's choosing to twist and mold this historical information to agree with his dogmatic position.
And I think that's important, because what bugs Rome and the Roman government is that particular narrative of the crucifixion, that you are worshiping a man who was executed, and Tacitus says, agreeing with the Gospels, that he's executed in the time of Tiberius under Pontius Pilate. So you've got that external attestation.
Tacitus is just regurgitating information that he got from 2nd century Christians, either directly or indirectly through Pliny the Younger. Both R.T. France and Robert Van Voorst, as well as a slew of other scholars, agree with this point, so it's really something that Dr. Litwa should accept. So instead of accepting this counter-argument that everybody agrees with, he unjustly eliminates this data and instead twists and molds the historical information to agree with his dogmatic position. I don't know, it kind of sounds like Dr. Litwa is fucking his own self up in this video.
Then you've got the Testimonium Flavianum, and this has been obviously very sharply debated, and I'm just going to lay down my cards that I follow mainstream scholarship here, in that the Testimonium in Book 18 is an interpolated passage, but that there was a core and in which Josephus did let his readers know about the existence of Jesus, who was called Christ.
Wait a second. I thought that interpolation wasn't a viable explanation. I thought that you just can't explain away data through interpolation. Isn't that what he said? Roll the tape.
Scholarship, whatever it is, ought to be able to be proved wrong. And you cannot simply eliminate data by a theory of interpolation.
Yep. That's exactly what he said. And now he's eliminating data by a theory of interpolation. That data being that Josephus didn't write the Testimonium Flavianum. Alice Wheely has shown that the only version that we have ever had is Eusebius's version, which is the uninterpolated text. Scholars like Dr. Litwa create an interpolated passage out of thin air because otherwise it doesn't make sense. Instead of facing this data head on, he chooses to mold and twist this historical information to fit his own dogmatic position. Instead of facing this data head on and revising his position, he chooses to twist and mold the information to agree with his dogmatic position.
And then he goes on, when in Book 20, when he deals with the death of James, to refer to Jesus, who was called Christ, as a kind of a back reference to this passage in Book 18. Now, there's endless debate about this, and everyone, should read up on this. But I think even if you reject the the Testimonium Flavianum itself in chapter 18, book 18, you can't so easily get rid of the reference to Jesus in book 20.
Except that's literally not a back reference to the Testimonium. A reference back to the Testimonium would have a lot more authorial presence and more awareness of the passage. Dr. Litwa is again just fabricating information here. Also, this evidence is easily explained as an accidental interpolation. The phrase, who was called Christ, is grammatically similar to other marginal notes that were made during this process. The fact that a completely different Jesus is referenced to later makes no sense if who was called Christ was originally there. It's more parsimonious if you consider that both James and Jesus were both introduced as being Ben Damnius. But I also know that Dr. Litwa only likes a hypothesis of interpolation if it suits his needs. Earlier in the Testimonium, he and other scholars fabricate this interpolated passage because it doesn't make any kind of sense coming from a Jewish writer like Josephus. In the James reference case, we're using common criteria in order to identify a potentially interpolated passage. This includes various criteria like, does the interpolated part grammatically match other marginal notes? And does the passage become more parsimonious when the interpolated portion is replaced? Our explanation for the James passage being interpolated only requires one particular phrase to be replaced, while Dr. Litwa and other scholars have to replace a whole 6 phrases in the Testimonium Flavianum in order to make that passage work. That's so much more complicated of a situation than just one phrase. Of course, I'm arguing for an accidental interpolation in the case of the James passage, whereas Dr. Litwa and other scholars are arguing for a purposeful interpolation in the case of the Testimonium. It's very obvious that Dr. Litwa has a skewed idea of what pseudo-history even is, considering that at every analysis today, he has proven that he is using pseudo-history in order to defend his position, even by his own standards.
And I think the problem here with mythicists is, and one of the reasons that concern me about the mythicist camp is that when they get evidence that contradicts them, they tend to want to erase it from history. And so that's a definite sign of deductive scholarship rather than inductive scholarship. Scholarship, whatever it is, ought to be able to be proved wrong.
What? So, explaining why a particular piece of evidence doesn't actually prove your conclusion is now erasing information from history? That's not what mythicists are doing, and if anybody here is erasing information from history, it's Dr. Litwa. We have seen him time and time again just simply erase data from history rather than facing it head on like he wants us to do. Except that we are facing the evidence head on. It's not the mythicist's fault that his bad evidence doesn't affect our position. Maybe Dr. Litwa should consider getting better evidence that actually proves his conclusion. That would be a step in the right direction, at least.
And you cannot simply eliminate data by a theory of interpolation, especially in the case of book 20 of Josephus's Antiquities. Absolutely zero manuscript evidence for an interpolation. Okay.
But he's done exactly that. He's eliminated data by a theory of interpolation. He eliminated the current Testimonium Flavianum by coming up with an interpolated version. A version that we have no evidence for, but must exist for his dogmatic position. Instead of facing this data head on, he just unjustly eliminates it. This is obviously not the work of an honest scholar. This is the work of a dogmatist. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. If you will, please go down below and let me know what you thought about Dr. Litwa's position. Do you think that he had good evidence for historical Jesus? Or do you think that it was pretty fucking poor? Let me know down below in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.